Hi friends. Last night was a great night for mushrooms. We had a little bit of rain yesterday, we had some warm weather. Last night we had a whole bunch of growth. So we got 3 that I'm going to explore today. Stick with me because at the end of the video we're going to talk about some of the detractors about mushrooms. But right now we're going to explore some here. So mushrooms will come up overnight in many cases, when the weather's just right, and need good temperatures overnight. We need moist conditions. Mushrooms generally have their mycelium spreading all around underneath the surface, and when there's enough moisture, then the caps will pop up. And of course it's the caps that we're interested in. So let's go explore around and see some of the mushrooms that we can find that are growing up around here. So when we're trying to identify mushrooms, we want to look and see what kind of environment, or what the environment is around the mushroom. In this case we got hardwood mulch. We want to observe and see what the mushroom looks like, and get down to its base, because all these things about mushrooms are going to give us important clues. So this mushroom, we have a bulbous base, we have the remains of the annulus or veil, and we have white gills, and we've got this pattern up here. I think this might be an edible mushroom, but I'm not sure, so we're going to go back and look at all the keys, and we're going to see how to use the keys later on. Here are some more fascinating mushrooms that came up. These might be chanterelles. This one got kicked off last night, but let's look. Remember, we want to notice everything we can about the mushroom because things are going to be important. So here we have a grassy environment, and we're underneath of I might call these hardwood trees, but we're underneath some trees here. That's part of its environment. White gills. The cap is fluffing up like this. Gills are right down to the stem. That's often an important clue right there, is gills right down to the stem. So let's go look and see if we can find another good mushroom. And generally speaking, when we get a little brown mushroom like this, we're going to be really suspicious, because little brown mushrooms tend to be the poisonous kinds. So we got a little tiny base, a nice slender stem. We got some dark gills there. No veil. Here we got another couple little brown mushrooms. Much more slender stems. Notice the conical shape of the cap. Much dark, very dark gills. We're going to add these to our collection today and go look at the identification keys. Alright, so let's go check out the identification keys and see what we have. We're only going to try to identify one of these. You know what? Before we go to the keys, we need to make a spore print. We'll be back with you in just a moment and talk about how to make spore prints. So making spore prints is kind of fun. It's a neat activity to do even if you're only an amateur mushroom gatherer. What you're going to need is, at the very least, you need a sheet of paper. what you might find is even more useful is a sheet of plastic. So here I have just a common sheet protector, and I'm just going to cut the sheet protector to give me individual pieces that I can put my mushroom samples on. You could probably do this with saran wrap. It's a little bit easier if you use a heavier gauge plastic. This might even be a little bit too light. I'm going to make 3 spore prints. So, yeah, you don't need any particular size. I'm making these about 2 by 3. And I'm just going to lay them down there. Now, another thing you're going to need for making your spore prints is a cover. I got these glass ramekins. They're going to make really good covers. The covers do 2 things. Number 1, the chief thing is they prevent air currents from disturbing the spores. And the second thing is they maintain some humidity so that if your cap isn't quite fully mature, it's still got some moisture to be able to do what it needs to do. Alright, so got my pieces of plastic. And the reason you want to have plastic or paper, and paper is at the very least white paper, but spores come in a multitude of colors. Mostly they're going to be brown, black, maybe some white. First thing you want to do when you're making a spore print is detach the stem from the cap. And then we're just going to take it and gill side down onto our media and then cover it. Now, we've got this big mushroom here, so how do we do that? We're going to just take a section of this cap, plastic down, gills onto the medium, and cover. And we're going to do the same thing with this chanterelle looking one. Remember to stick with me to the end, guys, because we're going to have some conversation about mushrooms as a survival food. Gills down and cover. Now the next step is patience. All we can do now is wait, because it's going to take an hour to perhaps overnight. And what we'll do is we'll come back and we'll look at the keys, the identification keys for this conical shaped little brown mushroom. We already know, because it's a little brown mushroom, that it's likely to be a poisonous mushroom. So that doesn't mean that large white mushrooms are all edible, nor does it mean that just because a mushroom has a shape that is familiar, is it the one you think it is. So we need to go and look at the spores. We need to look at the environment, the shape of the mushroom, its features, and all of these things we're going to look through the keys. And the keys are going to help us to identify, but we cannot get a positive identification without doing microscopic study, looking at the spores under a microscope, or perhaps even using a DNA sequencer to be able to identify them by way of DNA. Yeah, it gets really kind of difficult. DNA sequencing is good for poison labs and good for botanists that are really trying to nail down exactly what they found. For us amateurs, the visual keys are pretty much what we have to go by because we just can't afford DNA sequencers. So now we've got our samples. They've been overnight and have had a chance to make a spore print. We'll look at this one first. It's easy to see this splotch here is a nice spore print. And we'll see one of the reasons for using plastic film is to be able to move it around onto different backgrounds. Now if we're lucky, that comes through on the video pretty nicely. Shows almost a photographic image of the gills. So this one has black spores. We'll look at the spore print from the big mushroom. And of course on the white side we can't see a thing because these are white spores. But that shows up pretty nicely there. And then finally our chanterelle looking one. Virtually invisible on the white. It shows up pretty nicely on the black. Now I know it doesn't show very well on the video, but these are slightly tan spores, white to light tan. Okay, so let's go look at the keys and see what our conical mushroom was. Okay, so the mushroom key we're going to use today is found at mushroomexpert.com. The primary collaborator on this website, the designer and etc., is Dr. Michael Kuo. If you visit this website, you really get a good, comfortable feeling that you're using information that really means something. The list of people who have worked on this, on the information on this website, is really rather impressive. Not just expert mycologists, but also common men who go out and gather mushrooms on a regular basis. I really can't say enough about this. One of the things that I really like about this website is that he's arranged the keys so that you can go out in the field and do a fairly decent job of identifying a mushroom just based on on what you can see with your eyes. Eventually we get to a point where with some mushrooms that we have to have much more than just what our eyes have for us. Some things that I ought to have had out in the field when I was collecting my samples. I should have had a ruler. I should have had a magnifying glass, perhaps even a jeweler's loupe to be able to really examine things closely. And we'll see why I should have had those things with me as we go along through the keys here. Just relying on memory alone and estimation alone may not be enough sometimes. So, let's look at the keys here. And we're going to start with the opening keys. Notice that these are arranged in couplets. We have the positive couplet and the negative couplet. And then for the positive couplets, or for the positives, we will see that we have a link to the next key, or we have a number indicating another couplet that we need to utilize before proceeding. So our first key here is, was the mushroom growing on other mushrooms? Negative. So we want to go to the next couplet, number 2. The mushroom with gills on its underside? Our mushroom did. So we'll move on to couplet 3. Was it growing shelf-like on wood? Not. So that's a negative. We're going to move on to couplet 4. Sorry about that. We're going to move on to couplet number 4. And did it have gills running down the stem? It did not. So gills not as above, mushroom growing on wood or elsewhere. We're going to move on to gilled mushrooms. We're going to slide down to the keys here. A lot of really good reading on this website. We're not taking the time to go through all that, but we're going to go on with the keys here. Our mushroom had a small cap. It was approximately 1.5 centimeters, so it fits the 1.5. The cap and the stem were not both brown per se. They were kind of a tan, so I'm going to go with brown. It was growing on the ground. It did not have a partial veil. The odor was not strong or reminiscent of cucumbers or fish. So there's our negative. If that weren't enough, the spore print was not white, pinkish, or dirty yellowish. It was definitely not pale brown. So we've got 2 negatives there. So we want to move on to couplet number 2. The spore print was not pink. So we're going to move on to couplet number 3. The gills were not very thick, they were not waxy, they were not distantly spaced. So we have a few negatives there, so we want to move on to couplet number 4. I need to pan down on this for you. Was the spore print orange? No, it was not. Moving on to couplet number 6. The spore print was not white. The spore print was darker than above. It was pretty much black. So that means we need to move on to the gilled dark spored mushrooms. It did have a stem, so that's a negative. Moving on to couplet number 3. It was not growing on wood, it was growing terrestrially. So we want to move on to couplet number 12. Hopefully I don't blind you as I zoom on down to couplet number 12. Growing in grass, on mulch or compost, and on manure and so on. That's a positive. We want to move to couplet 13. So our spore print was black. The gills usually liquefying at maturity. That's a negative. Smaller species, short-lived and fragile. I don't know. I don't think it was necessarily fragile. It was a little tenacious as I picked that. So I don't think we get to move on to coprinoid mushrooms. So we're going to move on to 14. Cap was medium-sized to large, usually whitish or brownish. Yeah, brownish. I don't know what medium-sized means here, so I might have to go back and read through some text to find out what medium-sized means. Convex or flat, that works fine. Pale at first? No, they were definitely not pale at first. Spore print chocolate brown? Yeah, possible. Partial veil was not present. I did not have a microscope I did not have a magnifying glass to look at that, so I should have had that magnifying glass. Nonetheless, I think we have enough negatives in here that we get to move on to key number 15. Spore print was not yellow-brown. The spore print was darker, dark brown, blackish brown. I think I want to call it black, but blackish brown is possible. We're going to move on to 18. Gills with a mottled appearance? Definitely not. So moving on to 20. Come back down there. Stem long and slender? Positive. Typically fragile and snapping in two easily? Possibly. The cap never brightly colored. It was often fragile and splitting with age. Now, something we didn't get to see in the video, but I've seen this often as I walk the dogs by these mushrooms all the time, so I have seen that it does split with age. The stem never bruising blue or green, that's a positive. Rarely with a sturdy ring. Actually, I've never seen the ring, so spore print typically dark brown, but sometimes darker. So I think we get to move on to Sarsaparilla here. I'm going to quickly scan through before I follow the link, the negative part. No, we don't get to move on to the psilocybins. Sarsaparilla. So we're going to move on to that. And now, looking at the pictures, this almost looks like our mushroom. This does not. I may not have caught it in these life stages. Let me see how it's getting a little bit more conical here. Definitely not this large. Let's go ahead and get in here. So I estimate that that's about 2 centimeters across. Ours was about 1.5. I'm looking at these striations here. I don't think I noticed these striations anywhere in its life cycle. The gills are definitely correct for our mushroom. And the stem was hollow like this. That's another point that wants to be observed, is whether stems are hollow or solid. Hollow and hollow. So I think this is very similar to our little brown mushroom. I think this is very apropos to us as amateur mushroom identifiers. When we're out there in the field in a survival situation, then I think we fit most of these criteria in couplet number 41. I think we are easily frustrated because we're certainly not going to have the keys with us out there in the field. We're not going to have access to the internet necessarily. We might have a tablet or a smartphone, but if it's working, terrific. If it's not, we hit that easily frustrated category. I don't carry a microscope out into the field with me. If you're out there in survival mode and you have a microscope, you're pretty darn lucky. Again, without access to the technical mycological literature, one of which is these keys. The key is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to know when it comes to identifying mushrooms. And just wanted to find a good edible mushroom. Well, that is definitely us in the survival situation. We're looking for food. A good edible mushroom, maybe we're not looking for mushrooms per se, but we're looking for food indeed. And I'm not sure what's meant by employed full-time outside of mycology. I think that's an awful lot of people. Nonetheless, these all take us directly to terrestrial LBM, earth-growing little brown mushrooms, or little boring mushrooms. So next we are going to look at mushrooms as a food. So mushrooms as a food, we're moved over here to nutritiondata.self.com, a great resource when you're considering foods. And we're looking at raw white mushrooms. Now, the first thing we want to do is get this to a 100 I always use the 100 gram sample. That's an easy one to compare all kinds of foods from. 100 being evenly divisible by 10. We can get to different sizes really quickly. 22 calories. That's 22 100ths of the total volume is our calories. It's very minimal. Fats are 1%. Our carbohydrates are 1%. Fiber, wonderful, it's 4%. I'm not really worried about fiber when it comes to our wild foods. We're going to get plenty of fiber in other wild foods. Protein, only 3 grams. Our common vitamins are pretty minimal. I'm going to slide down here, and while the proteins are pretty small, we have some pretty decent protein quality. It's really only lacking in a few, like lysine. Our calorie information is like we noticed, very small. Carbohydrates is very small. Our vitamins are very small except for riboflavin. Riboflavin is a standout. Niacin is pretty okay. But overall, we can see, looking at the percent daily value, that's based on a 2,000 calorie diet, of course. We're really lacking in all our nutrients there. Our minerals are pretty small also, copper being the standout. But overall, what I really wanted to look at was the amount of calories in a survival situation when we're staving off starvation. What we're really concerned about are calories. And at 22 calories per 100 grams, it's an awful lot of mushrooms to try to ingest to be able to keep ourselves up. 22. Remember, we're looking for 2,000 calories for a day, and that's at pretty minimal exertion. 22 calories means that we need to eat we need 2 orders of 10, so we need to eat almost 100, 1,000, 10,000, 2 orders of 10. We need to ingest almost 10 kilograms of mushrooms to get up to 2,000 calories. Not a very good food to be seeking after. So the object in this video was not so much to explore a wild food, but to explore a whole genre of foods that we really can't rely on. You can see how difficult it was to go through all those keys, and at some point we get to the point where we have to have a microscope to be able to make the determination. And there are even those, like I said earlier, during the spore prints, you might even need a DNA sequencer to really know what it is. So unless it's a mushroom that you really know, because somebody like an expert has taken you and shown you this is an edible mushroom, it's just too difficult for an amateur to accurately decide what is and what isn't edible. It can be exciting and it can be a really fun adventure to explore these mushrooms, but if you're caught out in the wild, if the zombies have been chasing you all day long, you just don't want to take the risk of eating a little brown mushroom or even a big delicious looking mushroom without knowing what it is. It could mean life and death. And in point of fact, there are many mushrooms out there that are deadly. The number of species of mushrooms that are deadly are so numerous compared to those that are edible that the chances of coming across an edible mushroom are very small. So while you're out there surviving, let's not eat mushrooms and just be on the safe side of things. Folks, thanks for joining me again on another adventure into the wild. In this case, wild mushrooms. I hope I didn't go over long with a video that ends up we can't eat this, but I think that's important to know. I think it's an important assessment to make about mushrooms as a potential food. Thank you for your subscriptions. Thank you for your comments. Folks, remember, the knowledge that you carry in your head, it weighs nothing and it takes up no room in your bag. We'll see you next time.
Storm's over. Rain gone. Storm's over. Oh, rain gone. Storm's over now. I'm on my way.